In the quiet chill of an autumn morning, Frank Mercer stepped into the Veterans Heritage Museum, his old brown jacket clinging to his shoulders like a memory. At 76, he moved slowly, his cane tapping softly, his faded 101st Airborne patch barely holding its threads together. He wasn't here for glory or speeches, just to sit, to remember names etched in black glass, names of men who never came home. But when a young clerk's voice called him a nuisance and a guard's hand gripped his arm, Frank didn't flinch. He just adjusted his sleeve, revealing a past no one in that room could fathom. What happens when the world forgets the quiet heroes who still walk among us? Step into Frank's story, where a single moment of recognition unveils a lifetime of unspoken valor. Frank Mercer didn't utter a single word when they branded him a nuisance. He didn't resist when the young security guard clamped a hand on his arm, a touch too forceful for courtesy. Instead, he merely tugged at his sleeve, the motion deliberate, revealing a weathered patch stitched into his old field jacket, a faded but unmistakable emblem of the 101st Airborne. That simple gesture shifted the air in the room. A voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the murmurs like a blade. "Where did you get that?" It wasn't a question. It was a man grappling with memory, a general whose gaze locked onto the patch as if it held ghosts. The museum's glass doors sighed shut behind Frank as he stepped into the lobby, brushing off the late autumn chill. At 76, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, his pressed flannel shirt tucked neatly into sturdy jeans. His brown field jacket, worn soft at the elbows, bore the scars of decades, faded threads on the shoulder where the 101st Airborne patch clung stubbornly, refusing to be erased. He moved with the measured pace of a man who knew time wasn't to be rushed, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor. No smartphone weighed down his pockets. He had no use for such things. He offered a polite nod to the front desk clerk, a young man who could have been his grandson, and started toward the exhibit hallway, each step steady but slow. "Excuse me, sir," the clerk called out, his voice tinged with a mix of duty and uncertainty. Frank paused, turning to face him, his expression calm as still water. "We require timed entry tickets now. Do you have one?" "No," Frank replied, his voice low but clear, unshaken. "I've been coming here every Veterans Week since the place opened. Just wanted to sit for a spell, quietly." The clerk faltered, his fingers hovering over the touchscreen in front of him. Another staff member, a woman with a clipboard, leaned in and murmured something, her words too soft to catch but her glance sharp enough to cut. Frank didn't need to hear to know what she thought. He's just loitering again. Without a word, he continued down the Hall of Honor, his destination a long wooden bench that faced the memorial wall. The wall itself was a somber expanse of black glass, etched with thousands of names, each one a life, a story, a loss. Frank eased himself onto the bench, his knees protesting with faint crackles. He rested both hands on the head of his cane, his eyes fixed on the names. He didn't speak, didn't pull out a camera or a phone to capture the moment. He simply sat, his silence a kind of reverence. The clerk's eyes followed him, narrowing slightly. He reached for his radio, and within moments, a young security guard emerged from a side corridor. The guard's shoulders were squared, his jaw set, as if he'd been waiting for a chance to prove his authority. He strode toward Frank with purpose. "Sir," he said, his tone clipped, "I'm going to need you to leave the museum." Frank looked up, his weathered face unreadable. "Why's that?" The guard flicked a glance toward the front desk, then back to Frank. "You've been reported for loitering. We've had complaints." Frank rose slowly, his joints creaking like old timber. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply nodded, adjusted his jacket sleeve to reveal that worn eagle patch, and prepared to leave. The guard, perhaps too eager, reached out and gripped Frank's elbow, a touch that crossed the line from guidance to control. But before Frank could take another step, a voice shattered the moment, resonant and unyielding. "Hold it." The guard's hand froze midair. Frank turned, his movements deliberate, to see a man standing at the lobby's entrance. The newcomer was clad in a pristine dress uniform, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons that gleamed under the museum's lights. Silver eagles perched on his collar, marking him as a general. His eyes, however, weren't on the guard or the clerk. They were fixed on Frank's patch, as if it had summoned something long buried. The room fell silent, every eye drawn to the scene. Frank Mercer's life had settled into a rhythm so quiet it was almost invisible. At 76, he wasn't frail, but the years had carved deep lines into his face and slowed his stride. Each morning began the same. He rose at dawn, brewed strong black coffee in a dented kettle that had served him for 3 decades, and took his time sipping it. Then came the walk down Oak Street to the park, where he'd sit on a bench beneath the sprawling elms, his favorite being the one near a weathered war statue. A lone soldier glancing over his shoulder, no plaque to explain his vigil. Frank never wore his medals, never spoke of Vietnam unless pressed, and these days no one pressed. The world had moved on, and he let it. At the corner diner, Sandy the waitress knew his order by heart. Rye toast, scrambled eggs, no salt. She never called him sir, only Mr. Mercer, a small gesture that warmed him. It told him she saw him, not just another old man blending into the woodwork. His apartment was Spartan, its walls bare except for a few bookshelves and a small radio that hummed with classical music or news. In a closet, tucked away in a box he rarely opened, lay his bronze star, a handful of unit photographs, and a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to a soldier who hadn't come home. Sometimes, late at night, Frank would pull out a photo of 3 young men on a jungle trail, their shirts unbuttoned, arms slung around each other, grins wide and unguarded. One was Tom Garrison, another was Frank. They'd walked through hell together, and somehow Frank had walked out alone. For years, he'd kept in touch with Tom's family. Christmas cards, a visit once, long ago. But life pulls people apart. Addresses change, phone numbers fade, and silence creeps in. Still, every year, Frank made the pilgrimage to the Veterans Heritage Museum. Not for the pomp of ceremonies or the drone of speeches, but for the quiet of that bench, for the weight of the names on the wall. This year, though, the staff didn't recognize him. Maybe they never had. To them, he was just an old man in a jacket too heavy for the season, lingering where he didn't belong. In a place meant to honor memory, they tried to erase his presence. But someone else remembered. The general, standing tall in the entryway, had been waiting for this moment, though he hadn't known it until now. The young guard's hand fell away from Frank's arm, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the general's gaze. Frank turned fully to face the man, taking in the steel-gray hair, the composed posture, the eyes that seemed to see straight through time. The general stepped forward, bypassing the staff as if they were shadows. "You're Frank Mercer, aren't you?" Frank studied him, the voice stirring something deep and distant. "I am," he said, cautious. "And you are?" The general's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close, tinged with respect. "Thomas Garrison. My father was Captain Tom Garrison." Frank's breath caught, his eyes flickering with its recognition. A memory surfaced, a boy in a faded family photo, bright-eyed, cradled by a man Frank had dragged from a collapsing bunker under a hail of gunfire. His voice softened, barely above a whisper. "You're his son." The general nodded, his expression steady but warm. "My father used to tell a story about a mechanic with a bad knee who carried him half a mile through a firefight, said he owed his life to a man who didn't wait for orders, just did what needed doing." Frank let out a soft chuckle, the sound tinged with bittersweet memory. "Tom always did stretch the truth a bit." "No," the general said, his voice firm, almost fierce. "He didn't." The lobby had gone still. Every conversation hushed. Even the front desk clerk, his face now pale, leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the moment. The general turned to the guard, who stood rigid, his earlier confidence dissolved. "You laid hands on a man whose service patch is older than you are. You'd do well to think twice about how you treat those who came before you." The guard's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled, though it wasn't clear if he meant Frank or the general. Frank waved a hand, dismissing the tension. "Let the kid be, he didn't know." "That's the problem," the general said, his voice low but cutting. "Too many don't." He turned back to Frank, his demeanor softening. "Would you come with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Frank hesitated, then gave a small nod. The two men walked side by side down the hall of honor, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. No one dared interrupt them. As they passed the bench where Frank had sat earlier, the general paused, his gaze lingering on the memorial wall. "You belong here," he said, his voice steady, "more than any plaque we've ever hung." Frank didn't reply, but for the first time that day, a faint smile tugged at his lips. By evening, the museum's front desk would hold a letter from its director, Mabel Lom, addressed to Frank, an apology for the day's events, though no words could fully mend the sting of being unseen in a place meant to remember. The office had been buzzing with more phone calls than they'd handled in weeks. General Thomas Garrison had personally reached out to Mabel Lom, the museum director, his voice calm but unyielding, leaving no space for deflections or delays. He was clear: no press statements, no fanfare. The priority was to mend what had been mishandled. That evening, Frank Mercer made his way home as he always did, his cane tapping softly against the cracked sidewalk, each step deliberate and unhurried. Yet something felt different, a subtle shift in the air. Eyes lingered on him now. Outside the diner, Sandy, the waitress who knew his order by heart, gave a warm wave before he could even raise a hand. "Your usual tomorrow, Mr. Mercer?" she called out. Frank offered a small nod, the faintest hint of anticipation in his chest as he looked forward to the familiar routine. At home, he flicked on the old brass lamp by his armchair and settled near the window, the quiet of his small house wrapping around him. It had been weeks since anyone had visited. Then came a soft knock, two gentle taps. Frank rose, opened the door, and found a young man in a worn navy sweatshirt clutching a brittle newspaper clipping. "Are you Frank Mercer, the one in this article?" the man asked, his voice tentative but earnest. Frank's eyes narrowed, wary. "What article?" The young man extended the paper, and Frank's breath caught. It was a grainy photo from 1972 capturing a younger version of himself, lean, dust-streaked, standing tall beside an armored transport. The headline blazed, "Local mechanic saves 6 in tunnel collapse. Bronze Star awarded." The young man's voice broke the silence. "I found this in my grandfather's things. He said you rebuilt an engine under fire, got everyone home safe. That was your squad, right?" Frank traced a calloused finger over the faded image, memories flickering like an old film reel. "I suppose it was," he murmured. The man nodded, his eyes bright with respect. "Thank you, sir." He didn't linger, just turned and faded into the dusk. Frank shut the door with care, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. By morning, a handwritten sign had appeared outside the Veterans Heritage Museum, its letters neat but unassuming. "To Sergeant Mercer, we apologize. Your seat is reserved." On the bench where Frank had been brusquely turned away the day before, a folded card rested, catching the first rays of sunlight. The front read, "Welcome back." Inside, in careful script, were 2 words: "We remember." In that moment, Frank Mercer was no longer just a name buried in dusty records. He was a man his town had rediscovered, a presence they could no longer overlook. The museum didn't issue a grand statement or roll out cameras. Instead, a letter arrived in Frank's mailbox the following Monday, its thick envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. The return address bore the name Mabel Lom, Director, Veterans Heritage Museum. Inside, a single page unfolded her apology. "Mr. Mercer, we failed to honor not only your service, but your very presence. Our staff acted out of ignorance and without the respect you deserve. That is our responsibility to correct. You are welcome here always, no ticket needed. We would be honored to host a modest gathering in your name, not for spectacle, but to say simply, we remember. With deepest respect, Mabel Lom." Frank held the letter for a long time, his eyes tracing each word. He folded it with precision and tucked it into the top drawer of his desk. No smile crossed his face, no sigh escaped his lips, just a quiet nod, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to finally see him clearly. That Friday, General Thomas Garrison returned, not in his crisp uniform, but in a simple pressed jacket, his demeanor soft yet commanding. He joined Frank at the diner for coffee, the two men settling into an easy rhythm, their conversation flowing like that of old comrades despite their brief acquaintance. "I looked into the name you mentioned," the general said, his voice steady. "Corporal Ellis, My father wrote about him in his journals, said he owed his life to a mechanic who didn't hesitate. That was you, wasn't it? Frank stirred his coffee, his gaze distant. Ellis was the brave one. That tunnel would have caved in if he hadn't braced the beam while I worked. I was just the guy with the wrench. The general leaned forward, his eyes unwavering. That wrench guy kept half a squad alive with a broken jack and a bent axle. My father never forgot you. Frank said nothing, the silence between them heavy with shared understanding. That evening, the bench outside the museum transformed into something more than a place to rest. A small wooden plaque had been placed beneath it, its inscription simple but profound. Reserved on Franklin Mercer, 101st Airborne, still standing. Passers-by took notice. Some stopped to read the words, while a few older veterans offered quiet salutes to the empty space, even when Frank wasn't there. The young security guard, who had once gripped Frank's elbow in haste, returned one afternoon, his cap clutched in his hands. He approached with hesitation, his voice low. I was wrong, sir. I read about you now. I didn't see it before. Frank met his gaze, his expression firm, but not harsh. I didn't expect you to. Just make sure you see the next one. The guard nodded, swallowing hard, and walked away, his steps lighter but humbled. Justice didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It settled softly exactly where it belonged. The idea began as a whisper, a modest gathering, Mabel Lame had said. No fanfare, no microphones, just a handful of people who cared enough to show up. But in small towns, whispers carry far, especially when they hold weight. By Sunday morning, the front lawn of the Veterans Heritage Museum was lined with folding chairs, the air crisp with autumn's touch. A single flag stood tall, rippling gently in the breeze. Frank tried to slip into a back row, but General Garrison wouldn't hear of it. You earned that front seat long before most of us were born, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. No hiding today. Frank wore his familiar brown jacket, but the 101st Airborne patch on his shoulder had been meticulously restitched, its colors vibrant and proud. Faces from his past appeared, neighbors he hadn't spoken to in decades. A woman from the diner bearing a warm apple pie while you were wrapped in twine, a high school boy snapping photos with quiet reverence. Not for social media, but for memory. No one gave long speeches. No music played in the background. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the soft tread of boots as the general stepped forward. He didn't glance at any notes. Some men leave marks you don't notice until they're almost gone, he said, his voice clear and steady. They don't demand praise or expect thanks. They just keep showing up, day after day. He turned to Frank, his gaze unwavering. When others fled, you stayed. When others hesitated, you acted. When this town forgot, you came back anyway. From his coat pocket, he drew a small, weathered blue box, its edges worn from time. Inside rested a service medallion, engraved with a single phrase, "For quiet valor that still speaks." Frank rose slowly, his knees creaking softly, and accepted the medallion with both hands. A few in the crowd stood. Then more. Soon, everyone was on their feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing in silent solidarity. Some moments don't need noise. They just need to be witnessed. In the weeks that followed, the museum's bench became a quiet landmark. Frank sometimes sat there with his coffee, watching the world go by. Other times, a history student would perch beside it, scribbling notes for a school project. Once, a woman left a mason jar of white lilies, no name attached. At the diner, Sandy stopped charging him for his meals, slipping his plate in front of him with a nod. You were always good to us, she said one morning, her voice soft. We just forgot to tell you. Frank nodded back, his words simple. It's all right, you're saying it now. Later that month, an invitation arrived from the local high school, asking Frank to speak at their Veterans Day assembly, a chance to share his story with a new generation. Frank Mercer, 76 years old, stood at a high school podium, facing 300 students and staff in a gymnasium faintly scented with polished wood in the restless energy of youth. He'd refused the principal's invitation at first, grumbling that he wasn't built for speeches, that words didn't come easy. But a handwritten note, signed by 20 students in careful, looping handwriting, changed his mind. We don't want a hero. We want someone real. Those words settled into him, heavy and warm, like a stone worn smooth by a river's current. So there he stood, no slideshow, no microphone buzz, just a folded piece of paper tucked in his pocket, untouched. "I've been called plenty in my life," he began, his voice low and steady, like gravel crunching under boots. "Mechanic, sergeant, husband, sometimes a nuisance." He let that last word hang, a faint smile flickering as a few students chuckled. "But names don't mean much. What matters is showing up, day after day, even when no one's looking." The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, holding its breath. Frank's eyes, sharp despite the years, swept over the crowd. Kids slouched in chairs, some leaning forward, others blinking hard, caught off guard by their own emotions. "I don't need applause," he said. "Never did. All I ever wanted was to know the things I gave, my time, my promises, my fight, meant something." He paused, memories flickering. Captain Tom Garrison's laugh cutting through the jungle's weight, Corporal Ellis's fearless charge under fire. If you've got someone in your life who shows up for you, steady and quiet, without needing a thank you, notice them. That's service too. Not just medals or wars. It's the small things. When he stepped back, no one clapped right away. No one stood. They just sat, taking in his words like dry earth soaks up rain. That was all Frank wanted. Not celebration, but to be seen for who he was, scars and all. Winter edged closer and the porch light outside Frank's small apartment finally stopped giving out. He'd climbed a creaky wooden stool one cold afternoon, muttering about cheap wiring in his stiff fingers, and swapped the bulb himself. Since then, it glowed steady every night, a soft beacon in the dark. Frank wasn't waiting for anyone. He'd never been one to expect visitors, but people started coming. Sandy, the diner waitress who always snuck him an extra slice of pie, began dropping by weekly with a foil-wrapped apple or pecan pie still warm. Mabel Lamb, the Veterans Heritage Museum director, showed up one evening with a history student, a kid clutching a notebook, eager to know how jungle humidity felt, how it clung like a damp second skin. Frank answered slowly, painting the heat, the way it made your boots feel like they were dissolving. One evening, the young security guard from the museum appeared on Frank's porch, his father beside him, a retired Air Force medic whose handshake was firm, almost sacred. They didn't talk long, but the moment felt like a vow, sealed without words. On Frank's living room shelf sat the medal from General Thomas Garrison, heavy with the weight of promises kept and lives saved. Next to it was a faded photo, 3 soldiers grinning in the haze of a Vietnam dawn, Frank among them. He'd taped a sticky note to the back, his handwriting careful. Still here, still grateful. Snow began to dust the sidewalks one night as Frank sat on his porch, flannel jacket pulled tight, a steaming mug warming his hands. The porch light glowed above, casting a soft circle around him, like a flag no one else could see. Across the street, a boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop, tires crunching in the frost. He waved, breath clouding in the cold. "Hey, Mr. Frank, my teacher read your story in class." Frank raised a hand, the gesture small but certain. "She said you weren't loud like other veterans," the boy called, grinning. "But you still mattered." Frank's smile came slow, like dawn creeping over the horizon. "Your teacher's a sharp one," he said. The boy nodded, then pedaled off, tires squealing as he rounded the corner. Frank leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking but holding steady, just as he always had. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a problem to be fixed or a shadow to be cleared away. He felt rooted, seen, home.